Welcome to the BC Archives. We are coming to you today from Lekwungen territory in downtown Victoria, BC, and we're really pleased to be with you here today. And I'm standing right now in front of the beautiful Provincial Archives building, which has stood here since actually 1968. I got it wrong. As I did my research for today's presentation, I discovered that the soft opening for this building was in fact 1968, so a year ahead of what I had said in my statement ahead of this program. It is a beautiful day here in Victoria, but it is a little chilly, so I think we will welcome you into the archives now and continue our presentation from inside. So here we are inside the Provincial Archives, and this is where researchers come in. This is their first glimpse of the Provincial Records collection that we have here in the archives. Today, Kate and I are going to give you a tour of some of the space for those of you who either haven't been here before, or maybe it's been a while with the pandemic. It's been a lot tougher to come on site, which we realize. And we also wanted to take the opportunity to celebrate this beautiful space. As many of you know, we are moving out to a new location in Colwood in a couple of years. So we're starting to think more nostalgically around this building and what it has meant for many of us here. The tour will go into some behind the scenes spaces, but unfortunately when we did our tech test, we discovered that because this is actually really in the depths of the building at the downtown site, the data doesn't always reach some of the further corners. So our foray into the behind the scenes areas will be limited. So as I've said, welcome. The BC Archives is the provincial repository for the government of BC. As a result, we hold records from all of the different ministries and some of the broader public sector agencies in British Columbia, records that are created by staff as they do their regular work and business, and that have been identified as archivists, by archivists as having long-term value. The types of things that we think about when we're considering government records for retention are their evidentiary value. So we're looking for records that capture a moment in time in the provincial government so that future citizens can look back and find out what was happening at a particular point in time in history. In addition to government records, we collect private or non-government records as well. And those records are ones that have significance to the province and come to us from individuals, families, companies, and organizations, and they come in all formats. So we'll see some examples today as we walk through the archives. The types of records that we look for that we might see are textual records, so anything written down. Written records might be in a ledger, in correspondence. They could be documents, government documents, signed things. They also could be typed. So just because they're written doesn't mean that they're handwritten or typed on a typewriter. They could actually be a Word file or another computer file as well. But anything that is written in format. In addition, we have photographs. So we have around just over 200,000 digitized photographs that are available on our database. But in total, we have over 5 million photographs. So lots of photographic evidence in the archives. We also have cartographic records, and I'll walk over this way to show you an example. Cartographic records are architectural drawings, maps, and plans. This is an example here on the wall. These types of records, sometimes when you think of maps, you think of street maps. That's kind of one of the most common maps that we're used to. But there's so much more to cartographic records and different types of information that can be contained within them. We also have audiovisual records, so things that you listen to or things that you watch on a screen. We also have paintings, drawings, and prints, and a number of other records as well that we'll come across. The history of the BC Archives is really fascinating and it's very long. We have existed for nearly 130 years in one way or another. So the archives was started as part of the legislative library. The provincial library or in the legislature started around 130 years ago. And right from the start, the provincial librarians began to collect documents and manuscripts that initially they were really focused on looking for evidence of the colonial times, so prior to BC entering Confederation with Canada. They collected the documents and stored them using mostly library cataloging systems. And then over time, that developed and became much more robust. Eventually, in the 1930s, they developed the Document Disposal Act, where they started to actually process government records on a more systematic, regular basis. In 1908, the archive separated from the Legislative Library and became its own entity. And it was in a number of ministries over its history, all the way up until 2003, when it joined the Crown Corporation of the Royal BC Museum. And that's where we are today. But going back to this building, it was housed, the archives was housed over in the legislature for some time. And then in the 60s, it began to be recognized that both the museum and the archives, their sites were not able to fully represent and be the robust sites that they needed to be. Recognizing that both organizations had heritage value, there was a push to have them moved onto a single location, even though they were in different departments of the government at the time. I encourage you all to read The Collectors. There's a lot more information in that book about the history of how we came to be on the site that we are now. But needless to say, the buildings began to be designed and were built, purpose-built for the purpose of holding the provincial archives. The building is connected by an intricate tunnel system, and I really wish that we had the ability to take you through it because it is really fun and strange to see. But unfortunately, there's just no data for our cell phones in there, which is a little concerning when you take one of the interior elevators and they have signs that say warning, if the elevator gets stuck, you can't make a phone call. So I always make sure to tell a colleague before I go in those elevators, just in case. But the buildings are all connected. And when they were first built, they did look different than they do now. And we'll show you some images of that once we go into the reference room. But what is now the IMAX Theater didn't exist at the beginning. There was a courtyard that flowed through the three buildings. The three standalone buildings are the Archives building that we're in now, the Fannin Tower, which is behind us and houses the collections of the museum, and the Gallery building, which houses the public galleries. So why don't we walk into the reference room, which many of you will have been in before, to see where the public goes to do their research. I'll point out quickly before we go into the reference room, the entrance to the Sisters of St. Anne Archives. This space for many years was part of the archive space, and we lease it out to the Sisters of St. Anne Archives now. The Sisters of St. Anne Archives has been here operating as a private archives for a number of years, and we have an agreement that we will be absorbing their collections into ours. Initially, that was set for 2027, but now we're looking to expedite that so that our collections, their collections become part of ours sooner before we move out to the new site. But this is where they're located at the moment. Things have changed a bit since COVID. So if you haven't been here since before the pandemic, you'll notice that things are a little different. The tables are facing a different direction. But otherwise, it's mostly the same. We've really worked hard to get back to something more resembling our normal state of operations. We do have more limited hours than we used to, and we still do require that you make an appointment to come into the reference room. But generally speaking, we're happy to have people come in and do research on site. So I hope you do get a chance to come and visit us. Thinking about this visit today, I was really thinking about the building, and I am already feeling nostalgic for this building, even though we still have a couple of years that we get to be in it. As you can see, if you haven't been here before, it was at the time that it was designed, it was really the height of interior design for that period, with the wood paneling on the walls and the kind of trippy, exciting carpet that sometimes makes you feel a bit dizzy. But it's really, I think it's quite beautiful. I think there was a lot of craftsmanship that went into the building. And as we came in, you might have noticed the beautifully carved doors on the outside, and we're going to see some photos of when those were made. I pulled out the records of, in case any of you want to come in and look at them, GR 999, which are the records of the public works records relating to the planning and design of the new museum and archives back in the 60s. These photos here, I'll let Kate scan the camera over them. These photographs show the artist who carved all of the great wooden doors entering into the museum and archives. And they're really beautiful works of art. They're all unique, they're all hand carved. And you'll see that the doors, both at the public entrance and at the staff entrance upstairs, are these designs. A lot of the records in terms of some of the more detailed plans around the building are actually considered current active government records. So they're kept by the facilities department here on site because of course this is an active building and they need to use them and reference them regularly. So we don't have a huge amount of material in the archives about the building, but some of what we have files relating to the committee that was formed to discuss what the building and the site should look like. There's a lot of other aspects of what they called a heritage court at the time, which is sort of the courtyard space between the buildings. So there's files relating to the development of that part of the outside part of the site. As we came through the native plant garden as well, which it was designed by the provincial botanist at the time. And it is now maintained by a group of volunteers who have an interest in native plants. Outside the archives building as well is a plaque about the site being put in and a time capsule that's buried in the ground there. So I'm not sure what will happen when we move if it's not due to be opened yet. So I'm not sure if we'll be transferring the time capsule with us. But I'm curious to see what's in there. I think it'll be really fun to open that up and have a chance to see it at some point. In GR 999, we also have plans. So these are a really small, this is a small printout of the plans of the building. And we'll actually see some better versions of this, but this is what the archives, how it was designed. And we'll head around the side of the table. And here we have some clippings from our clippings file about the opening of the new Provincial Museum and Archives. As you can see, 1968, I stand corrected from my original dates. And over here, I thought this was really interesting. In this clipping, they have this section about the archives, and I will read to you what it says. It says, the overall workings are something that the public will have to learn about slowly. For example, they won't often see inside the tower or archives, the low-lying structure facing the sunken ponds. In these buildings, materials will be available for research only. Of course, this sort of idea that we are hidden away and not accessible to the public is something that we've been fighting against, well, obviously since 1968, probably even before then. But there are some really beautiful images of the buildings and some insight into what the feeling was in the province around the time of the buildings being open, which wasn't without controversy. The archives part was, I think, mostly smooth sailing in comparison to the museum, but there was definitely some interesting things happening at the time in the museum. And here we have some photographs that show the site. So down in that little photograph, you can see the parking lot that was this site before it was built on. And then up here, you can see it without any cars in it. But there's Douglas House, and it's empty at that point. But that whole space, that whole corner was used as a parking lot prior to it being developed for the Provincial Archives and Museum. And then there's some better shots on site on the website, but this just happened to be in the same folder, a shot of the courtyard between the three buildings. So We'll walk a little bit through the reference room, and we're trying to walk really slowly. This is our first time using this technology. I think it's working so far, but we'll walk through the reference room and look at a little bit more in the reference room. And if you haven't been here before, you can see that there's this space over here with the tables, but we also have a lot of reference materials. So we have card catalogs, we have hard copy finding aids, and we'll be going by the microfilm cabinets as well. I know some researchers have been asking, so I do want to reassure everyone that the microfilm is coming with us to the new building. We're going to head over now past the areas where we can view different types of materials. So we have our kiosks for researching our database. And over here we have various equipment to access audiovisual material that is still on cassettes or VHS. We also have a digital station for the material that has been digitized. We do have card catalogs still. And partly that's because some of the collections that we have, although they are all in our database, or mostly in our database, in some cases, it's still easier or helpful to use the card catalogs because not all of the collections have been indexed completely. Although everything is there, some of the old-fashioned indexing is actually incredibly helpful. So we're not quite ready to give up our beautiful card catalogs, which we all really like. So I'm going to pull open this one here. And Kate, if you can zoom in there on that card, you can see that we have, this is our map catalog, and we have plans relating to the Provincial Archives, the building that we are in now. And again, these were all developed by the BC Department of Public Works. And there's a couple different ones there. And when we find records in the map cabinet, they are all referenced with microfiche. So we can go and look now at some microfiche and see what the original plans for this space was and how much it's changed in that time. Something that I imagine with the new building we'll probably find happens as well. The new building at the moment, we've hired folks to build and design the building, but you know, that takes some time. So we haven't seen the final design layout. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops as we continue to plan. So we're going to be looking at this microfiche. Doesn't look like much, but it's got some interesting information on it. And I'm going to move out of the way so that we can have a really good look here. And it should clear up in just a second as it focuses. There we go. So what we're looking at right now is the original plans for the room that we're in right now. So this here is the reference room. And interestingly, as you can see, it's one great big rectangle. The spaces that many of you would be familiar with that are carved off as the microfilm reading room and what we call the fishbowl, which is an area that the archivists use for processing new collections, that was not built into the original design. So originally it was a very large open space. It's still a large space, but we have carved off those extra rooms. Up here you can see this space is described as archives display space. That is where the Sisters of St. Anne Archives is now. So that space originally was an exhibition area. And I encourage you all to go on to our YouTube page. And there is an episode of Webster where they actually do a tour of part of the archives. And a couple archivists do interviews as part of the Webster episode. And they walk through the archives display case. And it really gives you a sense of how much space there was and how much interest and appetite there was for archival exhibitions, which I think it was very shortly after opening, unfortunately, that they discovered they needed that space for a number of other things. So that space was taken away. And now we only have a very small display cabinet in the foyer. Some of the other things you can see down here is that in the behind the scenes area, I'm just going to move this over a little bit. For those of you that ever have had the chance to go on a tour behind the scenes, down here, this is part of the stacks. But then here, this room, it's called cataloging, and they actually had staff sitting in that room doing cataloging. I can assure you that that would not be a pleasant room to sit in. It is dark and windowless, and it is now used as a storage space where when we order records in from offsite, that's where they go, and we organize them and get them ready for researchers. Over here, this is that sneaky tunnel I was telling you about. So this tunnel goes all the way up behind the archives and eventually goes into the exhibition space where they develop exhibitions for the museum. There's also museum storage space. And my understanding is that originally this way, it would take you to the legislature. That is closed off to people like me. So I don't get to walk through the tunnel into the legislature, but I have seen the other end of it as well from the legislature side, where there's a big door that is closed off and locked to the legislature staff as well. So we don't get to sneak in between the two buildings, unfortunately, although it's fun to think about people doing that. But the tunnel between our space and the museum space still exists and is used every day. And that's actually where the records that are brought in for researchers come in through that tunnel. So why don't we head behind the scenes a little bit, and please, if the friends, folks, tech people could let us know if we lose signal, that would be great, because we're going to try to not go too deep into it, but just give us a shout if we get too far in. Okay, so this is where we want to be careful. I was hoping to take you way into the back and show you all kinds of stuff, but when we did our test run, we lost signal. This space is what I like to call kind of it's a combination of a processing space and a storage space, and it's been used in a number of ways over the years. So when I first worked here on a contract way back in 2011, there was a number of offices set up in this room. Those have all been moved away, and there's one main staff who works down here, and he's a digital preservation specialist. And unfortunately, I don't think we can quite get signal enough to show you the equipment that he uses, but he takes analog media and turns it into digital media whenever possible. So depending on the types of records and how fragile they are, we try and do as much as possible on site. Although we do send things off site, especially if it's a large collection or if there's any concern about it being damaged in the process. But that all happens down here. And this is also a storage space. So as you can imagine, you can see there's a lot of stuff out ready for packing because we are preparing for the big move in a couple of years. But as you can imagine, it's a bit daunting to think about packing up the entire Provincial Archives. I suppose in this case, it's one of the times that I would say it's lucky that we keep a huge percentage of our records off site. So out of all the records that we hold in our holdings, I usually say that it's between 2/3 and 3/4 of it that are kept off site. So it's a fairly large portion of our collection that is kept off site, and that has to be ordered in on a regular basis as researchers request it. The things that we keep on site include older material, things that are heavily requested that people want to access regularly, more awkward records like maps that are a bit harder. We do keep maps off site, but they are harder to transport. So we keep a lot of maps on site. And things that are really fragile or particularly valuable that we're concerned about having them move back and forth more regularly. Hopefully we don't cut out. I promised I would open drawers. So I'm going to open some drawers so you can see what our map cabinets look like. Now they're not all that exciting to look at first glance. But you can imagine again how much material we have. Each of these map cabinets contains between 50 and 100 maps. We keep the maps and architectural drawings upside down so that we can see their reference code easily. We request researchers to have a look on the microfilm first to make sure that they're identifying the right thing that they want to see before we start pulling out the originals, because as you can imagine, it can be a bit awkward to pull out original maps. And these cabinets, there is lots of them around this space. Up above in the mezzanine is our photographic storage area. So the types of photographs that we keep on site are things that are stable and that we're not putting at risk by keeping on site. So things like black and white prints that are relatively stable, glass plate negatives. The types of things that we don't keep on site in terms of photographs are color prints, color negatives, certain types of negatives that are particularly fragile or volatile. Those go in cold storage. So they're stored offsite in cooler temperatures. And we try and have those digitized if possible before we send them offsite. That's not always possible though. So we do have to regularly go out and bring things off and on site. I always know when staff are preparing to go to cold storage because they come in with all of their winter snow gear ready to go and take things out of the frozen vaults. Even in the middle of summer, sometimes they have to come with their toques and everything at the ready. So it's kind of fun to see. So this gives you a bit of a sense of what the storage is like. It's a jumble, but it's a good jumble. I think we have fairly good control over where everything is. So yeah, gives you a bit of a sense of behind the scenes. We will go into the stacks a little bit as well. So you'll get to see what that looks like. All of these bays of microfilm contain a mixture of, on this side, this is all private records on this side. So these are records that we've identified as being particularly of high value for having copies made so that people can access them more easily. The far bay against the back wall is all government records. And the two in the middle are newspapers. So newspapers, of course, are secondary source material, but they're very useful as a complementary type of information for researchers doing their primary source research. We don't keep the major newspapers because those are relatively easily accessible, but we keep the smaller local and regional newspapers that may contain information that's harder to find. And those we are keeping and will be coming with us to the new building. As we go forward, we don't make new microfilm. Anything that comes in that we identify as having either preservation needs that require it to have a copy or that have access needs, so things that we think might be more highly requested and we want to have more copies available, those items are digitized. That doesn't mean we're going back and digitizing all the microfilm because that's not possible, unfortunately, with time and resources. In rare occasions, we identify microfilm that is a high priority that we need digitized. But for the most part, the microfilm is stable and we're keeping it as it is, but everything going forward is digitized. Let's head into the stacks now. So when the building was first opened in the first, I'm not sure how long, the first couple decades at least of its existence, researchers were actually able to go into the stacks. So I don't know exactly what the arrangements were, but I know that regular researchers or researchers that were doing long-term projects were given a desk space in the stacks and they were able to go in and stay there for long periods of time. That doesn't happen anymore for a number of reasons. A big part of it is security, but it's also because of time and space and resources. So we simply don't have the space to have more people. We have staff that sit in the stacks and we don't have any space to have researchers in here as well. But the big concern is the security question. So again, friends, if we're breaking up, just let us know. I think we tried it. I don't want to go too much further in case we lose signal. I wanted to give you all a quick little glimpse into the stacks. I mentioned the orange shelves in my write-up. We have these very state-of-the-art shelving units. Of course, if you've been in a newer archives, most archives have really fancy rolling shelving units and other types of storage space. I'm sure this was incredibly high tech and fancy back in 1968. They have not changed since then. Again, I find them quite endearing, but it will be nice to have nice new rolling stacks in the new building. The bottom two floors, a good portion of the first two floors of the stacks are taken up by the Provincial the Northwest history collection of the library. So this was a library collection that was started in the Provincial Library and then transferred into our custody. It's a really interesting collection. It's really helpful for researchers because the scope of the collection is slightly more expansive than the rest of our records. So it does include places like Alaska and as far south as Hawaii. So it covers the entire Pacific Northwest, which is really useful. And a lot of people, even regular researchers, aren't aware of some of the gems in the library collection or sometimes forget about them. So I wanted to make sure that you all got a chance to see what it looks like and also get a sense of what might be in here. Normally on a tour, I would take you right to the furthest back corner, which is where we have the section on the early explorers. And we have some really exciting and interesting books in there, some really old, fragile books that talk about the explorers that came over from Europe and wrote back about what they saw. A lot of them were here collecting flora and fauna and interested in that sort of thing. So there's some really interesting accounts there. In this section, I pulled out a few things from one of my favorite parts of the library collection, which is the pamphlet collection. People might not be aware that we have a pamphlet collection, which is a type of library resource that is really interesting. These are things that are sort of in what we call a gray area in terms of library collecting. So they're not published monographs, but they're also not primary source material. They tend to be things that are widely distributed, but they're not formally published in the same way at times. So this was kind of an interesting one that I found, which is an account describing all of the provincial archives in Canada, a bit of their history and what they have and how researchers can access them. We also have more typical pamphlets like this one. This is a pamphlet of the Emily Carr Gallery, which was operated by the Provincial Archives in the 90s. It was a standalone gallery to exhibit the works of Emily Carr that we have in the archives. In addition to these types of pamphlets, the pamphlet collection also includes some really, really fun stuff. There is menus from various restaurants. I was really excited to find a menu from a restaurant that my uncle, who was a chef, had trained at. So it was called Chez Marcel, and he learned how to cook French style there, which was really exciting. So there's really fun things that you wouldn't necessarily think of or be aware of. So I always encourage our researchers, in addition to looking through the BC Archives database, we have our library database, which is separate. You find it through our website as well. Always make sure you look through there if you're coming in to do research. The library is non-circulating. It's for use here in the reference room. But if you're coming on site to do some research, definitely check out the library collection as well. The other floors of the stacks, to give you a sense of what they look pretty much like this. But instead of books, they have boxes. So the types of boxes that you're used to if you come in and do research, or that you saw when we were out looking at the records out in the reference room, you can picture these same orange shelves, but covered in boxes. So I think we'll head back out to the reference room and we can take some questions and chat more about the space. And on a nice sunny day like this, it's a pretty nice view to sit in the reference room and look out over the pond. Not a bad spot. So with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions. If anybody has anything that they'd like to ask or an area that they want more information about, anything at all.
Hi, everybody. It's Lara Wilson from Friends of the BC Archives. You can put your questions in the chat and I will convey them to Genevieve. But I'll start out with a question for Genevieve. The tunnel that you mentioned between the archives building and the ledge, what would that have been used for? And I gather it's not used anymore or used rarely.
My understanding is it's not used at all anymore. And my understanding of its original use, I have to admit, is anecdotal. I don't know how much of this I could prove with documentation, but my understanding is that it was there as a potential escape route for the premier and staff who might be in danger at some point. I also understand that there was at one point maybe a tunnel going from this building over to the Empress as well. So the rumor is that there was an entire network of tunnels. But again, I can't actually back that up with real documentation. I'm not sure if Dr. Roy is in the audience today. She might be able to give us some more information about that. I know she's done a lot of research on the building with her work on the collectors, but those are the rumors that the staff are always told.
Okay, thank you. And I believe Dr. Roy is on the event, but first I'll get to a few questions that came in the chat. And Robert Janning has asked, is there an approximate date set when the current reference room will be closing to researchers?
Yes, so now the caveat is that it always changes. It always shifts and changes. You know, government has changing timelines all the time. My understanding is that the new building will open in early 2025. And because we have a legislated duty to remain open and accessible to the public, to have the archives accessible, we will be keeping any closures to an incredible minimum, maybe a day or two. We're really hoping not to have it closed any more time than that. So exact date to be decided, and we'll announce it once we have it. You can expect it to be around January 2025.
Thanks, Genevieve. Question from Thomas. What's the most unexpected thing the archive has, or at least obviously in your experience?
I should be better prepared for this question. People ask this all the time and I never have a good answer. There are so many unexpected things. There is a very old coin that we often cite as being the oldest document in the collection. That is, I believe it's Chinese, and it's very, very old, like many thousands of years old. The most unexpected thing that I've come across is a couple things. When I was processing records of Henry McBride, I came across a number of items in his records, including a wallet and his eyeglasses. But the most interesting thing for me was a letter that included locks of hair from one of his daughters. So I always find that a bit odd. I know that was a very common thing in the past. I have also found in the records of a museum, it was sort of like a Victorian space where they would show, interesting and exotic collectibles. In amongst those records, they had tucked in some rare feathers, but also a snake skin. So just flattened in between documents around the incorporation of the business was a snake skin, which was surprising to say the least.
Yes, I think that qualifies as unexpected.
Yes.
Question from Kevin. What will happen to the building after you leave?
That's a good question, and we don't know that yet. The government has complete control over what happens to the site. And I don't know exactly what will happen to all of the spaces. But I believe the Fannin Tower and the archives have been confirmed that they will come down, but I don't know exactly all the details around that. That's up to the ministry folks to determine.
Okay, thanks. Next question from Delphine. Genevieve, could you talk about the original paintings and print storage and how to access information on them?
Yes, that's a good question. And again, another space that I would love to take everyone to, but it is so deep within the building. There is absolutely no cell coverage there. The paintings, drawings, and prints vault is a space that is, so when we went into the room where I showed you the map cabinets, it's just off the back corner of that room. It's a 2-story vault, and it is where our documentary art collection, as well as some of the modern art that our current curator has been collecting. It has hanging storage, hanging racks to hang paintings on, as well as flat storage, similar to the map cabinets for keeping flat items. The collection has really evolved and changed over time. So the way that those items came into our collections really varied. A lot of it is considered documentary art, which means that it is collected for the same kinds of reasons that original archival material is collected. So it's collected in order to because it has some significance to BC. Either the person who created it was significant to BC, it might depict an event or activity that is significant. Not in all cases are they high quality works of art. Some of them are not, and some of them really are. Including, of course, we saw the pamphlet about the Emily Carr Gallery. We have a large collection of Emily Carrs, as well as other really prominent painters. Many of you might be aware of Grafton Tyler Brown. The Friends of the BC Archives were able to help us purchase the Grafton Tyler Brown painting a couple of years ago, which is a really great addition to the collection. In terms of accessing it, we have a curator of art here. Her name is India Young, and she's the main point of contact for accessing the art vault. In some cases, if it's a smaller item that is kept in a folder, it's kept flat and unframed, we are able to bring it out to the reference room like we do other items in the archives. But for larger items, it really requires the visitor to go into the vault with a staff member to view that work of art. It's almost 100% digitized and on our database. So if you go into the database, you can narrow down your search by doing an advanced search by graphic items that will include paintings and photographs. But if you do a search and include the letters PDP in the search, then that will narrow it down to the paintings, drawings, and print collection. Did I cover everything Delphine asked? I'm not sure if I completely covered off
yes,
her whole
thanks.
question. Okay, great.
And thanks for the tip about searching. I think that'd be very helpful for folks. Next question from Lauren. During COVID, are the exhibits in the lobby of the archives accessible to the public?
Yes, they absolutely are. And we've had an exhibit up for some time that we did not change as frequently as we normally do because of COVID, but we are looking to change it now, so soon. So currently our exhibit is on a journal from Prospector Yukon Joe, and it will be changing into a new exhibit in the coming months.
Okay, thanks.
But it's just in the foyer. Oh. Anybody can come and see that.
Okay. Question from Kevin. Is the archives moving due to lack of space or for other reasons?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess the most diplomatic answer is that there's an entire website dedicated to modernization of the museum and archives that goes into all the different reasons why we're moving. That's probably, anything I miss in my answer will be covered off on the website. So if you go to the Royal BC Museum website and search for modernization, it'll come up with a lot of information about it. It's a number of reasons. The site is aging and and there's issues with the buildings and the site. So again, a lot of the decisions around the big decisions are made by our ministry partners. So again, I think probably your best bet is to look at the modernization page because it has all the different reasons laid out there.
We might be able to put that link in the chat too. And there we go. Thank you, Jesse or Thomas. Next question from Kathleen. Is there a timeline and resourcing to digitize the remaining photos in the collection? I think the number I heard is that 200,000 of the 5 million have been digitized. Thanks. I think I might know what your answer is, Genevieve.
I imagine you probably do. We won't be digitizing all of the remaining photographs. We do have a priority, a system of prioritizing what we digitize. So certainly there are certain collections that are a priority for digitization. And we have our digital access specialists working on those constantly. A lot of the photographs, to give you a sense of what some of them are, we have a lot of photographs that are government photographs. So for example, we have tens of thousands of photographs that are things like forestry photographs, aerial shots of swaths of land, and they're really interesting and really amazing. But digitizing those wouldn't necessarily be the best use of our resources. They have a really great index system, so they're pretty easy to search physically. They're also all very stable and easy to look at in their physical format. So there isn't a preservation concern about them in the same way that there would be about other photographs. So certain collections like that that are incredibly large are very low priority for us because we know that they're safe, we know that they're accessible, and the amount of times that people request access to them is fairly low. What we're most concerned about are photographs that will be losing information because of their format. So if they're color photographs, we know that certain types of color photographs fade very quickly. We want to make sure those get digitized and captured before that happens. And photographs that we know people want to access all the time. So there's certainly types of photographs that we know are requested on a regular basis, that there's a lot of urgency around making sure that those are accessible, and those are the ones that we prioritize. So it's a constantly evolving priority list, but let's just say we are always digitizing. It is a constant daily effort, and we will never catch up to the 5 million, but we are making sure that we keep up with as much as we can.
I just wanted to jump in and say, when I was an intern at BC Archives over 20 years ago, I remember helping with the cold storage of some of those forestry negatives. That was quite labor intensive.
Yes.
Here's a new question. Do you have an area for new records that need to be quarantined before they are processed?
Great question. Yes, we do. So everything that comes in from a non-government warehouse site, so something that is coming from someone's house or a private storage facility where we're not sure, we don't have regular inspections to make sure that the space is environmentally safe. All of those come in and they go to an inspection room that is upstairs in the archives building. They get locked away in that room, and that room also has freezers in it, so that if something comes in and there's any hint or detection that there might be insects that have been infesting the records, they can be wrapped in plastic and frozen in order to kill the bugs. Our preservation and conservation team inspect all of the records that come in from offsite, and they review them for mold or any other issues, any other damage, and then they can send those to the conservation lab to be worked on before they go into our storage here. Records that come from government storage, they have ways of checking up on, they have environmental controls. So we don't inspect every box of government records that comes in because they've already been stored in a space that has environmental controls that should be protecting them from things like infestations and temperature changes and fluctuations.
Okay, thanks. Another question, and this is probably a question that you hear on a regular basis. Do you accept donations? And if so, what kind of items do you accept? And that's from Carol.
Great question. We do accept donations. We have an acquisitions archivist whose main job is to go through all of the acquisition offers. So you can email that person at acquisitions@royalbcmuseum.bc.ca. And the types of things that we look for when we're considering acquisitions of new records, we look for provincial significance as the top one. And that's really hard to define. What we're interested in are records that capture something that is really crucial and important to the telling of the history of BC. And of course, our understanding of what that might be changes over time and fluctuates. So if you think that in any way your records have provincial significance, please do reach out. We're also looking for complete collections of records. So although in the past, especially in the early days of the archives, we would collect one-off items, particularly photographs or anything that we thought was important to BC history, We now try to avoid doing that as much as possible. And we're really looking for the entire collection of records relating to an activity or a person or a family. So for example, a private collection I can think of that we received a few years ago was for the Cedar, Shingle company. Cedar, Shingle, yes. I always have to say that twice. That's a hard one to say. And that company is an example of one that the company closed. They had all of their records for the entire existence of that it was open and operating. And they were able to give us those in its entirety. Having the entire collection of records is really useful for researchers because you can see the evolution of a company over time. You can see all the different activities it was involved in. You can see how things, how attitudes and business practices changed over time. That contextual part is really important to researchers here. So if they only had a handful of documents, we probably wouldn't have accepted them, but it was a really great representation of their business. When we are offered items that either they're not complete enough or we don't think they have provincial significance, we will often work with the donor to find other suitable repositories that we think might be a better place for their holdings. We also work very closely with places, of course, like UVic, with Lara, and with other institutions where if an institution has a particular collecting mandate and they have built up a reputation for being the central repository for a certain subject matter, then we may suggest that it might be better suited to that repository, and even if it's something that we may have an interest in.
Thanks, Genevieve. And again, that was acquisitions at royalbcmuseum.bc.ca.
Yes.
Question from Kelly. What will you miss most about the building?
About the building? Oh, so many things. I really like the wood paneling. I know some people are divided about it, but just the space in general, it's of its era, but I really like this era. I like the buildings from the 60s. I think that they're really well designed, and I don't know how to explain it, but I definitely have a strong connection, feeling like I have a strong connection to this building. And I love the exterior of it. And I have been, if you look at photos before the IMAX was built, obviously I love going to the IMAX. I don't want to complain about the IMAX in any way, but before the IMAX was built, the flow of the three buildings together with the courtyard in the middle, it was incredibly beautiful and aesthetically pleasing. And that has already changed with the IMAX being there. So some of the things that I feel nostalgic for, you know, they've changed over time, and but it'll be hard to leave these buildings because I think that they were really thoughtfully built. They're very beautiful works of architecture that it's sad to think of going to something modern and new. I'm obviously a very stereotype of an archivist. I like old things, so there's nothing wrong with modern, shiny new buildings. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of really positive things about it.
Thank you. I'm just here. We've had a question about when, sorry, this is not a question for Genevieve, but a question about when the Friends are going to resume to in-person presentations. And that has been answered by one of my colleagues who says we are hoping that we can return to in-person events at some point next year and are working with the RBCM to determine when that can happen safely, but we can't provide a more concrete answer at this point. So there are lots of moving pieces, and we miss in-person gatherings too. But we, sorry, there are two more questions so far for Genevieve. What are you most looking forward to in the new building? Are there any standout wish list items beside rolling shelves?
Oh, I was going to say rolling shelves again. There's a lot of things I'm looking forward to in the new building. Although I love this building, and even though it was, in theory, purpose-built as an archive, it is very much lacking in a lot of the practical things that we need. So what am I most looking forward to? I am looking forward to stacks and storage spaces that you can walk through without feeling completely claustrophobic and cramped. And the rolling shelves will play a huge role in that. It's really hard to navigate our stacks as they are, because they are just becoming increasingly more full over time. So having storage space that is really built with modern archival preservation practices in mind, that's a huge part of it. I'm looking forward to, there's going to be dedicated learning spaces, which it will be nice to have that in the same building. So as an outreach and programming archivist, in the past, we've really struggled to find ways to incorporate larger programs and learning opportunities in the archives, because the learning spaces are all in the museum building, and we're very cautious about removing archival materials from our building. In the new building, there will be spaces that are in the same building, so we'll be able to navigate original source material into learning spaces, and without having to leave the building, without having to go through public spaces. In theory, I think the hope is that there will be interior spaces to move that material around safely. So having those dedicated spaces that we have access to will be really helpful, and will really help us expand our on-site programming. And I want to say there's other things, but I can't think of them off the top of my head. But I mean, having modern storage is a big one, where our storage is very, very much out of date.
Question from Delphine: how many staff are at the archives?
That's a hard question to answer, because of course, there's a lot of staff that are centralized services that are shared by both the museum and archives. But so there's a few different teams. We have a government records, government archives team that exclusively process government records as they come into our custody. And that team currently has 3 full-time staff. The archivists that work on site, there's 6 archivists that work on site that do non-government records work. So they do a number of different things, including processing private records, providing reference services, answering inquiries, managing our database and our library program, doing acquisitions. So all of that on-site work that we do here. So there's 6 archivists for that. Then we have a preservation team that that's one of those shared services where the preservation team is focused on the type of material that we use here. So I consider them, they report to the archives. They are mainly archive staff, but they do a lot of work with other departments that have photographs and documents. So records in similar formats to what we have here. And they have, oh, sorry, and I should say before I do that, there's 3 access specialists that work here in the reference room, providing access services. And then the preservation team, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think, on the preservation team. And then of course, there's all the other shared services like HR and finance, and the learning team does a lot of work with the archives. So there's 27 people in the archives department. But like I said, some of that's sort of shared.
Genevieve, we have had a question about the choice of callwood, but I would think that maybe that needs to, that question might be answered by the modernization page.
Yes,
information.
Yes, it would.
Okay, thank you. And then we've, another question, will the new location mean the end of remote storage?
No, so that was a big question in the development of the plans for the new building. I don't remember all of the details around the final decision making on that. Again, that's sort of between the ministry and our board. But ultimately, no, the remote storage is going to remain the same. It is, the location of the remote storage is not public, but it ultimately doesn't make that much of a difference where they're delivering to. So the remote storage will stay as it is for now, at least for the foreseeable future.
Thanks, Genevieve. That was the last question, and we've had also some comments of thanks for this great tour, and people have very much enjoyed it. Oh, sorry, we have another question. No, we do have another question. Will the hours for research be increased at the new location? That's a question from Robert. Do you know anything about the hours?
It's really hard to say. Unfortunately, like all of you, we're living in this state of flux right now with changing rules around COVID. So at the moment, we're keeping our hours, more limited than we used to. And that is because of the new processes that we've had to put in place in terms of responding to researchers and having appointments booked. I would hope that by 2025, we'll be able to be a little bit more back on track, but I really don't know. I'm so sorry, Robert. I'm sure you're desperate to get back in here with longer hours, but at the moment, we do have to stick with what we have.
Thanks, Genevieve. And it's 6 minutes past 3. So I think we have reached a good point to wrap things up.
Great. Well, thank you all for inviting us to come and do this. And I'm glad that we were able to bring people through the archives this one time when people maybe haven't been able to come on site for a while. So hopefully people do get to come and have a visit on site before our big move in a couple of years.